Hello, ladies and gentlemen. On 3.2, honkaistarrail is reworking the 50-50 law system, and I thought it would be fun to evaluate the characters added. This includes a simple overview, their position in the meta, mostly concerning their problems and their value as a 50-50 loss compared to their value as a limited unit. I will also be giving my thoughts on the system itself, the pros, the many cons, and some concerns that I have with it. Before we start this video though, I highly recommend you watch my 5-minute explanation on the 50-50 loss rework, because I will not be explaining the system itself and you might end up more confused than an American at a salad bar. Please watch that if you still haven't, but if you already have, then let's get on to the video. The first character is Seele, the oldest limited unit in the game. Seele is a quantum hunt unit and her special gimmick is Resurgence. Resurgence gives Seele an extra turn when she eliminates an enemy, essentially doubling her damage if you manage to play it well enough. She has advance on her weaker basic attack, which makes her a very technical character to play in addition to Resurgence. But pretty much anyone that engages in meta discourse knows the score about Seele. She is considered one of the worst victims of Powercreep. And while I really hate that label and I usually do not believe that sentiment as it is way too common of a criticism, it definitely applies to Seele's concept. As an enemy HP based character, Seele would have been a perfect design that relies on skill with managing enemy HP. The problem with any enemy HP based character though, especially in gacha games, is the ever lovely concept known as power creep. These characters in gacha games would have to keep continuously evolving to raise their threshold, but at some point it will become too annoying to deal with. Granted, this isn't always the case, especially in HSR. A character like Little Herta is meta after all, but Resurgence specifically doesn't allow Seele as much room to grow as Herta. Herta can rely on evolving damage dealers or supports to trigger her spins without any care in the world, with the exception of DOT of course. In Seele's case, she has to deal with it all on her own. She does not have a designated DPS she particularly synergizes with to trigger her straight gimmick, like Herta and Big Herta. In fact, a stronger DPS can steal her Resurgences. She is a lone wolf that relies on her own aging multipliers to get the job done. This wouldn't have been that much of an issue, she just needs stronger supports then. She had a chance with Robin, but it further became more of an exposure of her archaic design. Robin providing additional damage would, in concept, make Seele less reliant on her own multipliers and let the supports trigger one-shots as well as enabling them. This would help Seele evolve her double turn damage despite her multipliers remaining untouched. The problem with this is that additional damage triggers last, meaning Seele can't trigger Resurgence if Robin's damage was strong enough to take credit for it. Oops. It's not really a surprise to see Seele, much like Little Herta, can actually play in PF because of how much lower the HP thresholds are. If we're expecting any character buffs, it's pretty much all multiplier increases and optimistically, Resurgence proc increases. Even though as we discussed, it would be a temporary solution unless she has enemy HP fixed damage, which would also be a mistake. As a 50-50 loss character though, what changes from her value? Unfortunately, not at all. Seele's Eidolons are laughable sadly, and most of the decent ones are past E4, meaning it would take a while to get an okay increase that doesn't fix her issues. The most impact she would have is replacing Yanqing, which she is outright better, but even then it's not recommended to build Seele at all and just focus on other characters instead. She would surely be at the top of the list for character buffs, so maybe we can hope for a little longer. Next one is one of my favorites, Blade. Blade is a dual scaling wind DPS. He gains a stack for every tick of HP loss he suffers and does an AoE follow-up attack if he suffers enough ticks. He rarely consumes SP, drains his own HP, and his ult either heals or hurts him. He is a really cool design. But of course, he's the biggest meme in the community for a pretty good reason. His dual scaling is a pretty old design that didn't age well, and he would have been much better off as a purely HP scaling character. Aside from that though, his multipliers are just not that good. They are quite aged as a matter of fact. But it is good that most of his problems pretty much stop there, even though he's the poster boy of the 8 cycle meme more than Seele. Blade is still one of the better designed old DPS, and his synergies with Jade and soon maybe Castris has kept him alive. In this current AoE focused meta with HP scaling, he actually can have some use cases over Fei Xiao, as he is a much better Jade driver with good enough AoE. Jade right now is so dominant that she can drag Blade to the finish line as a sub DPS assisting in Blade's smaller AoE. AoE focus. Though it is fair to note in this current meta, Jade would rather have Lingsha if being used with Sunday due to her higher AoE frequency. But at least Blade is actually 3 cycling with a casual 6 cost team, which shouldn't really be overlooked. How is Blade as a 50-50 loss then? Actually, I think this would have been the second best thing to happen to him. The best thing would just to make him a standard DPS, but anyway. Blade is a weaker character in the revitalized roles he's been somewhat good for. As a Jade driver, Lingsha is outright better and provides more value to your account than a DPS. If you're looking for an HP based carry, My Day blows him out of the water in almost every way, both offensively and even defensively. Blade is not an efficient pool in the slightest, needing more cost to be competitive, which evidently makes his reruns feel really bad. With his new position, he can serve as an alternative that you can quote-unquote luck into. A weaker one, but still good enough to clear with this current environment. And having more options being more accessible is an outright good thing, right? And he is set for a buff. We aren't sure how big that buff is, but it will affect his value at least positively. Now we have a clear hierarchy with 4-star Arlan, 50-50 Lost Blade, and limited My Day. Isn't that nice? Another one of my favorites is the 4'11" Lady Fu Xuan. Fu Xuan is a tank that mitigates through damage reduction, healing as small as herself, and redirection. If you hit a party member that isn't Fu Xuan for 100 damage, Fu Xuan reduces it and takes a larger portion of the damage. She can resist CC for one time with her skill, heals through her ult, and uses charges on herself to heal a huge amount when reaching low HP. She also has an adorable team-wide crit rate buff. Despite her kit being quite good though, Fu Xuan falls short of expectations. As an older character, that's pretty inevitable, but the main reason for her decline is not because her sustain is weak. If anything, she feels really balanced and the rest are unnecessarily broken in defensiveness. The main issue is her teams. Every single sustain after her had a clear team which they provided a chunky increase to. Huohuo with RMC, Aglaya, the Herta, and Hypercarry teams has found her calling as an energy bot sustain. Aventurine for Fei Xiao and Robin teams. Gallagher as a generalist SP generator and QPQ user for battery, or debuffs for Acheron teams. Lingsha as a Brig enabler and Jade driver. Even Luocha is now on My Day teams due to his excessive raw healing. Meanwhile, all Fu Xuan has to show for is a small crit rate buff, with her defensive nature not particularly benefiting HP loss characters, and only with her E1 she becomes sorta competitive with crit hyper carry teams. For sustains, she is essentially a middle of the road character with no real direction, while others can outperform her in every team with a clear leaning. This doesn't mean she is useless, but it does make her value very low for anybody that doesn't have her. I guess that means that Fu Xuan is a bad 50-50 loss. No, honestly, Fu Xuan is the best out of these 3 characters and probably the most perfect character for this system. Like I said, Fu Xuan's defenses is good but not broken. Her buff is not mind-blowing, but it is generic. And she is a middle-of-the-road character with no real direction. She's perfect for this. She can serve as a good enough tank alternative if you lose, and her early E1 actually makes her somewhat of a mini harmony to any crit scaler. She serves as a much needed heavy upgrade from Jeopard to offer buffs and being a strong wall, while not being too imbalanced to trivialize limited characters. This is possibly her best place of a unit with her design. With all those evaluations out of the way, what do I think about this system update? First, let's get to the good stuff, the pros. Obviously, it feels less bad to lose a 50-50. Instead of Yanqing, you can get Seele. Instead of Jeopard, you can get Fu Xuan. Instead of Bailu, you get Blade. This rework gives you more chances to feel less bad about the result. And in the case of Fu Xuan, a much needed power adjustment from the 1.0 units. Depending on how the future works, this can keep rising to help players scale with power creep. The second thing, because of the precedent set by Blade, one thing is clear. Being sent into the 50-50 loss pool system doesn't mean you're doomed for buffs. Even with the weakest of the pool being Seele, you may bench her for now, but later on she can be unbenched and wreak havoc with her new updates. This system allows you to get Seele free of charge and not feel the need to gamble as much to pull her for future viability, because you didn't intend to pull her anyway. Lastly, there's less issues with rerun droughts. With this new system, reruns become less of a pain and droughts would not be an issue. Seele disappeared from 1.4 and Ratio is only now having his rerun. The simplest reason for this is that a rerun for those characters would only be taking up a slot for a rerun that would actually sell. Truthfully, none of these 3 characters would sell on a rerun anymore, so might as well just put them here to give players a chance to lock into them without needing to dedicate a full rerun. While I said all those 3 good things about the system, it's definitely not perfect and there's a double-edged nature to pretty much every point I put out there. First, and the worst one possibly, is that you can't guarantee it. Any Genshin or HSR vet will tell you, getting a specific standard is not that easy as it sounds. Take from my example, I had to wait for almost 8 months to get Bronya, and that's from the 300 pull selector. And with all my 50-50 losses and standard pulls after that, I never got E1 Bronya until the free standard selector a year later. If I was aiming for Fu Xuan with this system, 2 years later from release, I still wouldn't have gotten Fu Xuan to even E0. It's not as straightforward as just pulling a Fu Xuan rerun because I have a spending cap. This system has none. Another oversight that I think needs to be addressed is the light cones. I recommend you watch my 5-minute explanation video because I'm not gonna go over it, but essentially you can't get Blade's signature even though he's a 50-50 loss character. It's fine, he does have alternative light cones, but that's only for now. What happens if someone who actually relies on a very niche signature, which is a good amount of units now, is added to the 50-50 loss pool? Now what? Are you gonna lose to My Day without his sig? And because of his rerun value being low, he never gets rerun again? This is a different takeaway from my previous point. Sure, this helps rerun routes from being more of an issue, but with how it works right now, some characters need their rerun to get an important part of their power and viability, their signature light cone. This system does not help with that, and if you're already having a hard time selling Seele now with her not so required limited light cone, imagine doing an Acheron rerun without her signature. To be a little pessimistic, even though character buffs for 50-50 characters will be a thing, this does give them an excuse to not buff them as much. Because Blade is put into this situation, I don't really expect his rework to be groundbreaking. I can expect Silverwolves to be massive, and I can definitely expect Kafkas to be massive too, because there's no sign for either of those units having their limited status be endangered. But with this system, they know the perception Blade has, and they will softball his rework. I suppose it's fair, but again remember that you can't guarantee one choice of these units. You have to be lucky twice to get the good ending, while you only need to be unlucky once for the bad ending. And it's outright going to be less likely that old character mains are gonna be satisfied with this. I also want to air out some concerns for this system's future in the long term. I'm concerned about the power scaling of Eidolons. Blade right now needs his E1 to be decent in Apocalyptic Shadow. As more updates come, this cost will keep getting higher. As a 50-50 loss character, what becomes of his ideal power budget then? Would his buffs make it so that he only needs his E0 now? Oyo knows that by that point many people already have E1 and are gunning for his E2. And so they'll scale Blade with his E2 as the bare minimum. Are they going to make his E2 the baseline then thereafter? What about in 4 years to 7.0? I guess he needs his E4 due to the inflation. Character buffs have to be balanced around how long he's been a 50-50 loss character, right? I'm quite concerned that this would still not solve the core issue knowing Hoyoverse's track record, but I'm willing to give them a chance and observe how they deal with this. And with my theory, this will slow down the need for Eidolon scaling, which is better than having it full speed, I guess. Speaking of which, I really need to see how they cycle this. Will they add another 3 characters for a 13 size batch? Or will they swap the 3 characters that they have and remain at a 10 total? I'm hoping the former because the latter would not be enough time to get the limited character that you want. But then that wouldn't make these units limited anymore and count as false advertising. Uh-oh. That's pretty much all the concerns I've got, which will be answered in time of course. To be honest, I don't think this solves power creep, but power creep is a pretty important part of the gacha ecosystem. Removing power creep altogether can be done since Hoyo isn't bleeding money, but power creep itself can exist without the bad side effects. With how Starrail is, you can't always do a surval and indirectly buff the unit when there's designs that rely too much on numbers without a specific niche, like Seele. What this new system with character buffs eventually will do is make sure the pool of viable characters is larger. Currently, if you had consistently 20 viable characters, in a year you'd have 30 units, 10 of which are unviable. The next you'd have 40, now 20 are unviable, then 50 to 30, then 60 to 40 unviable units. You notice the portion of unusable units keep getting larger and larger. What character buffs and this system will do is keep cycling in characters being meta and obsolete, but widening that pool. Say you start with a game at 20 viable reliable characters and 10 outdated characters. Buff 10 for the next year, then it's 30 to 40. Do it again, then it's 40 to 60. With enough consistent buffs, you can have a consistent percentage of usable to Powercreep characters and keep them fresh without feeling like pools becoming a waste. You just have to wait your time with a fave and then see them dip for a while before coming back again. I promise you this feels much better than never seeing them again. And while I can't trust this exact generous situation will be the case, it at least puts us on a good track to a healthier metagame. Anyway, I hope you guys liked that video. Like, comment, and subscribe, do the algorithm stuff, and that's pretty much it. Thank you to my members, especially Man42 for the highest tier possible. Bye bye.